This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I'm your host, Kara Szymborski, and this week I'm joined by two half-men, half-rat hybrids, Paul Jasley
Hello, humanoids.
and Nick White.
I've been called worse.
So this is a very special episode this week because very shortly we will all be graced by the film Kraven in cinemas. And I have been like absurdly overhyped for this movie for absolutely no concrete reason, because I have read maybe 3 Spider-Man stories my entire life. I have read 0 Kraven stories. It's just that first poster of what's his face like slouching with his abs and like the furry like coat thing strewn open. I was like, yes, that film is going to be garbage, and I'm ready for how campy and queer it's going to be, because here's my hot take about the Sony Spider-Verse. It's all very, very queer. Like Morbius is super gay. Like the whole Venom thing is like, Eddie Brock and Venom are boyfriends. Like,
sure.
I there wasn't anything where I was like, oh, hell yeah, in Madame Web, but maybe they'll do a sequel. I mean, but like the majority of it has been where I'm just like, ooh, you're like leaning into the like homoerotic aspect of superhero comics. And I, for one, am here for it. I am here for this like B grade superhero shit that doesn't really like tie into a bigger universe. They say it does, but does it? I don't think so. Anyway, so all this to say, because I'm so hyped about this film, we realized, oh, I should probably read a Kraven comic book. Paul, can you tell us which comic book we're reading?
We read Kraven the Hunt from 1987. This is a book that I've always heard is one of the best Spider-Man stories of all time. When I was a young teenager reading Wizard magazine, they always hyped this as being the best Spider-Man story, or one of the best. And I'm glad I read it for the first time to talk about it, because I have no history
read it for the first time
with
here?
Kraven. Yes, this is my first time reading it.
Oh, this is so exciting. I thought you had read it before.
Oh, no. I've always wanted to read it, but I'm like, I love Spider-Man, but I have no connection to Kraven. But having heard about it for so many years, I was very excited to read it. So this came out in 1987, originally published by James DeMatteis, who, of course, co-wrote all of the great Justice League International stories with Keith Giffen back in the 80s. And then art by Mike Zeck, who's like an amazing artist. It was republished, like I said, 1987, across several Spider-Man titles at the time. It's a great story. Yep. So I had a great time reading it for the first time. My first impression is that I cannot believe how mind-blowing this would have been to read it in 1987. Spoiler alert, the first issue of this series, Spider-Man gets killed by Kraven. Where do you go from there? Right?
Well, I guess where do you go from there? Because this is before everything became an event all the time, right? Everything became an event. Everybody died. This is like pre-Death of Superman event over at DC. It's like around the same time as Crisis on Infinite Earths. It's like comics are just starting to kind of get to where we consider superhero comics to be like standard fare these days. Nick, had you read this before?
Well, I think I've read this before for this very podcast. I just can't seem to narrow down when.
Yeah, you were pushing back hard on this one. You were like, no, we definitely read this.
I definitely can tell you, like, I'm not embarrassed to say I went through like my Amazon purchases account, and there's like a block of like 3 or 4 Spider-Man trades, like all purchased at the same fucking time, never again. And this is one of them. And it definitely would have been like 6 years ago. So, for me at 6 years, every book is a new book. Every surprise is every twist, happens again. So,
That's kind of beautiful, though. That's like the whole, like, what is it? Every 7 years, every cell in your body gets replaced. So,
Well, if you like this, I have a Adam Sandler, Drew Barrymore movie that you might actually thoroughly enjoy. If amnesia is such a wondrous gift in your book, I have.
all right, fair, Nick. All right. So I don't really have a spider background, and I have zero Kraven background. Paul knows some spider shit and zero Kraven. Nick, where do you fall with the Spider-Man awareness?
I mean, outside of having read this fucking book before,
You didn't
like
remember,
right? Like, yeah, it was one of those faint things where you're reading and you're like, have I read this before? Or am I just reading it for the first time and I'm convinced I've read it before?
Oh, me with X-Men Hoxpox. That was me reading Hoxpox for the second time. I was like, I think I did read this, but I did not wait 6 years between my rereads.
Otherwise, my Kraven knowledge is it was that Fox, whatever the Spider-Man, Fox Saturday morning cartoon was back in the day. Kraven was definitely a part of that. So it would probably be that. And I think more than a couple times I thought it was just Tarzan or whatever and said that's fine.
All right. So like Paul said, this book opens with Spider-Man dying, quote unquote. He's like very clearly like buried under the ground. We don't know that he's spoilers. Yes, this is obviously full spoilers for Kraven's Last Hunt.
Full spoilers for this book, and or if you happen to see the fucking front cover of this book, you would probably also know that. Yes.
All right, so Spider-Man's dead, and Kraven the Hunter has decided that what he needs to do to prove that he is the best hunter ever is kill Spider-Man or like knock him out. That was never really clear to me. Take over for him, prove that he is the better Spider-Man, and then like unalive himself into a coffin because he's done. Like once he has completed his journey as a hunter, he's done. And like obviously it's comics, so he's not done, but like that it's such a dramatic arc. And I think it was really helpful for me to read, the Marvel Selects trade edition of this that started with the introduction from the writer explaining that once he realized that Kraven is like old school Russian, that like clicked for him narratively to be like, I can go Dostoevsky on this. I can get like real bleak and like philosophical. And that showed for me in reading this story.
Yeah. I mean, that was my first impression. Again, like as a teenager reading Wizard comics in the late 90s, like that was the thing where like every time they did like a top 10, here are the best Spider-Man stories, this was always in the top 10. And I made a note of that until I read it for this first time. Like, and I have no really connection to Kraven as a character, but I feel like this series did a good job of explaining that context where Kraven is a Russian character. There's some Dostoevsky. He's like making up for his parents being like exiled from Russia. He hates Spider-Man, but it's not so much about him killing Spider-Man physically. It's about him killing Spider-Man intellectually or spiritually. So when that shift happened where Kraven's like, I killed Spider-Man, but now I need to become Spider-Man. That was an interesting twist. I mean, that, and I feel that that's happened several times throughout Spider-Man's history. Like, I never read the Superior Spider-Man story. Like,
was that the one where Doc Ock?
Yeah. Became
Spider-Man. Where he lands the glider in his back.
What?
Or was that the clone?
It, so
That's the clone.
What? Wait, did you say land a glider in his back?
He lands a glider in the back of Spider-Man, except I think you find out that it's that clone of Spider-Man.
Oh, Ben
This is like glider. I understand the words that you're saying are English words, but I'm having difficulty picturing what you're trying to describe.
Yeah, just parks a glider right in there.
Oh my god.
Spider-Man it's too much to comprehend it sometimes.
Okay, so this has happened to poor Peter several times then.
Several times. The idea of that a villain would take over Spider-Man's personality I mean, has happened in the past, but I feel like this might be the first version of that where it's like Kraven becomes Spider-Man, and I really like that idea. It was like, not only do I have to defeat my villain or my enemy, I have to become my enemy. I mean, I don't think I understand Kraven's motivation, but like that did make sense to me. It's like
the intellectual flowchart is a little weird when he's first so the first thing I need to do to prove I'm better is kill him, and I'm like, okay, that makes sense. This tracks.
Sure.
We've seen this one before. Gotcha. Check. Good. Then I need to become him. Well, that doesn't really seem necessary. I think we've already kind of like why. He's like, I'm going to prove that I'm better. And I'm like, you already killed him. What do you like? He's not going to see you do it unless it's from like, staring down from heaven with the telescope or whatever.
Yeah.
With his uncle hanging out with his uncle that he inadvertently. So yeah, it's kind of, it's an interesting idea. And like, I mean, if he was like, I'm going to become Spider-Man and then show Spider-Man a different path or how I can, and we've seen that in narrative arc before where someone, I mean, clearly, when we've seen Bruce Wayne sidelined a couple times and somebody else rolls in and is like, I'm a fucking edgelord. Watch me kill people. This is what you should be doing. Like we've seen this before. But that's not what this is, which is also interesting because it's not that. Even Kraven at the end is like, yeah, I mean, turns out there's this dude under the mask. He's not half bad. I think he's actually an okay guy. But I'm not really interested with him. I'm interested with this, embodied idea of the costume he wears.
I mean, that's what's so frustrating about superhero comics, that they have to keep going because they're serialized. Like narratively, this is a complete story, but it doesn't matter because it's going to go right back to like, he's alive, Kraven's going to do something else, we're going to forget this journey that we all went on.
Well, so at least does Kraven survive this story?
It sounds I mean, God, like I willed myself not to fall down too much of the stupid Wikipedia rabbit hole, but it sounds like after this story, they were semi-ardent about keeping Kraven dead for at least a while.
How long did that last?
So I think it was like 5 or 6 years.
That's not bad. That's okay. That's impressive, actually. Yeah.
And then, his family tried to revive him, right? So,
sure.
What are you going to do?
What are you going to do? Yeah, they kept mentioning in this book, like, how Kraven does all of his stuff. They, like, implied that he's not immortal, but, like, has some kind of, like, herbs and
right, yeah,
he's
found some ayahuasca in the jungle. And
yeah. It's like every time they just kept going... They kept going back to like herbs and roots. I'm like, what have you found?
Taking the Alex Jones stuff that makes you red, the Alex Jones power, whatever.
Oh, Kraven's secrets revealed.
Yeah, I found it really interesting that this book. I don't know if this was in the intro note. It was definitely on Wikipedia that the editor. Well, that they originally wanted the book to just take place within whatever book like the writer was writing and the artist was drawing at the time. But then the editor was like, it's gonna seem kind of weird if like Spider-Man is in these 3 or 4 other books and he's alive and well and he's fine and he's tying up Mysterio in webs, and then in this other book he's dead. And so they made the editorial choice that this book would take place across 2 issues of Web of Spider-Man, 2 issues of The Amazing Spider-Man, 2 issues of Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man, but it was all the same team. And I thought that was really a pretty wild choice because you don't see that happen much, right?
Yeah.
You see like 8 Spider-Man books, maybe there's 8 Superman books and you kill him in one, but he's alive and well in the others. And okay.
I mean, I
thought it was an interesting choice.
Yeah, I feel that's why, like I said earlier, it's like when I was reading Wizard magazine as a teenager, this story's always got mentioned as being like a groundbreaking, one of the best Spider-Man stories ever told. And like, that has to be part of it. The idea like this story ran across 3 separate titles in 1 year. And it felt very definitive. Like, again, like Spider-Man gets killed, quote unquote, in the first issue.
Right.
It keeps going across other stories like that. At the time in 1987, that was a pretty bold move to do that, which I think maybe that's why it's celebrated as being such an important story. You know, so.
Yeah. The late 80s timeline is interesting for me because I feel like I haven't read that many superhero comics from the 80s because I'm usually either more like the modern stuff or like Silver Age, and then the stuff from the 90s and the early 2000s and like late 80s to early 2000s. I'm just kind of like, if I read it, it just like I don't think I've like sought out those stories. So reading this book and like seeing the art style, I realized that I haven't read a lot of comics with this type of art style, and like knowing that it was the 80s, it felt very 80s, if that makes sense.
I do want to touch on that because I feel this is one of the most 1987 comics I've ever read. Because again, it's just
it wasn't just my assumptions.
No. It's just before my time. Again, I would have been like 5 or 6 when this comic came out, just before my time. But reading it made sense because I've read enough comics around this time. And again, this is 2 years after Watchmen, 2 years after Dark Knight Returns. And you can already feel the influence of those comics in this.
Yep.
One of the first things I noticed about this comic was that there is no omniscient narrator. All of the caption boxes are internal monologues of the characters on the page. And they're all doing the Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns stream of consciousness, what the character's thinking. And I don't hate that, but I feel like reading this comic all in one go like I did, it becomes very repetitive. It becomes very repetitive.
It was a little trippy for me. It felt like reading Arkham Asylum Serious House on Serious Earth felt like that. That book is like reading a fever dream. And so that's kind of what this reminded me of. But I hear what you're saying with the repetitiveness, because there were definitely like in each issue main exposition or plot points being repeated, and reading it all together, I was like, okay, I know that already. But if you're reading, 2 issues in each of the Spider series, maybe you've got a reader who doesn't like know about events because events are still new. That makes sense. I understand why the repetition had to happen. But you're right. Like reading it all at once, I was like,
Especially because there are 4 different characters who are narrating throughout it. And James DeMatteis is a good writer. So like they're able to vary the flow of each writer, of each character in the story. But like, it does feel repetitive at points. When they have 4 different characters doing narration, it does feel very repetitive. The last 2 issues, when it is very much Peter Parker, his stream of consciousness throughout those issues, it does feel distinct, but you're already 4 issues into a 6-issue story at that point. You know what I mean? Well,
also the first like issue of his stream of consciousness is him just saying Mary Jane over and over again.
2 weeks.
Yeah. It is repetitive, but also he's just been underground for 2 weeks, like maybe disoriented with a magical serum thing. So it's like, I get it. Your powers of speech are coming back. That was my biggest like suspended disbelief. I'm like willing to believe that like Kraven knocked out Spider-Man and then like took his costume and like tracked down the other villain in this story, Vermin, and that like Vermin is a half like animal, like half person who's like cannibalizing people on the streets of New York City. I'm willing to suspend my disbelief for all of this. What I could not let go of was the fact that Spider-Man did not suffocate in a coffin 6 feet under in 2 weeks. Like,
I think that all just gets wrapped up in the mystery of these weird herbs and practices
roots.
that Yeah, his rituals and whatnot. Yeah.
Well, I don't like it, Nick. It should have been explained to me. If we can bother to explain over and over again all these different plot points, I should know how Spider-Man survived.
I do want to talk about that aspect of the story. Like, there are multiple characters in the story who are having hallucinations.
Sure.
Yeah.
And the artwork, Mike Zeck is such an amazing artist, where like the hallucinations never feel super trippy. They feel very real, which is how the characters in the story are experiencing them. You know what I mean? There's not like weird, like, oh, I'm having a fucking fever dream. I'm like weird.
They
trippy...
melt away at one point or another, right? But before that, it seems real. Yeah.
Yeah, you're experiencing the hallucinations the same way the characters are. Like, I think there's a second issue where like Kraven is seeing like a giant spider made out of like flies or smaller spiders, and it's like
smaller spiders.
That's fucking real. I mean, the way it's drawn feels very real, and like I feel the way Mike Zeck approaches the hallucinations in this story are like, that's the way the characters are experiencing it. It doesn't feel like you're like, oh, they're high, or you understand their motivation after that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. While we're on the subject of the art, Nick, I think you wanted to say something about butts.
Oh, I mean, yeah, there's a lot to notice about this art. Like, one thing straight away to what Paul said, like, you could tell it's an 80s comic when you get to that point where they're like burying Spider-Man, and it's like the background is like all like purples and blacks, like the background colors, it's just really purple up against like the really green grass. And like when you see that people are like, oh, let's use purple, like that's like, hello, this is an 80s comic, which is great. I'm okay with it. That's fine. But beyond that, no pun intended, there's a lot of butt in this comic for a comic that is like, what, maybe fast approaching like 40 years old, and it's like a big two, arguably mainstream comic that is what, arguably not that far removed from some element of the comic code being a thing, you know, that did stretch for a while. And I'm just like looking at this and I'm like, I don't know if somebody said anything to anybody. Like, was there an editor's note at some point? Like, I'd love to see the script where it's just like, he's got a great ass.
I mean, I feel, Nick, I think you make a good point. Like, again, like I said earlier, like, this is 2 years after Watchmen, 2 years after Dark Knight Returns. You can feel the influence of those books.
That's a great point.
Comics
if
code
you're following
is
those two books, you can probably get away with some stuff. Yeah.
The comics code is pretty loose at this point. Again, there's a moment, like the first time you see Vermin like kidnap a woman, you see her bones like in the sewer that he like chewed, clean. I was like, that's pretty edgy for this time.
Yeah. Anytime, Paul, because I was reading this and my overall reaction was, this is dark for a Spider-Man comic. No.
Yes. Yeah.
There was even a part where I was like, he killed her, right? Like,
this
happened, right?
Vermin was eating women in New York City, like snatching them from the sewer, saying like, I'm hungry. Grab a lady, take her off into a dark alleyway, and just like scraunch on her face or whatever. Like it's pretty horrifying, actually. So
it's exactly. Yeah. Again, like I think I mentioned earlier, it's like the idea like this is happening at a time where comics are shifting. They're not just for kids anymore, so they have to be like a little more edgy.
They're what, for cannibals? Like, is that the angle that they're going for here?
They're for cannibals.
Social deviants.
Oh wow. It's like maybe like leaning into that with the comic code thing, like post comic code being like, well, you think I'm disgusting? Look how disgusting I can be.
Well, and then it's also, I mean, I don't like. I don't know if this book is quite as bad as it. This is always what my mind goes to, is just the Arrested Development scene where he's got the magic group and they've got the "We demand to be taken seriously" sign. And like, I don't know if this book falls like as bad as like the "We demand to be taken seriously" sign, but like the idea that it's the Spider-Man book and it's got all these different edgy things that definitely feel more R-rated, but then also like the idea that like this is an intellectual Spider-Man book, so we're going to quote William Blake a bunch of times, and clearly we're going to quote his poem The Tiger, which I can get into later because I did do a little interesting research on that. But beyond that, right, like it's a Spider-Man book, but Spider-Man's in it for what, 20%? Right?
Yeah.
Like, so that's
It's
like kind of a little, that's an edgy idea in its own right, that it's a Spider-Man book that's really not a Spider-Man book.
It's a Kraven book.
It's a Kraven book, really. Yeah. Yeah.
I did want to touch on that idea where it's like when you see Kraven take over as Spider-Man, and again,
Who's his tailor, by the way? Like, clearly he doesn't put on the old suit. He's got someone making a new suit
he
for
had
him.
one made, and like that,
he looks fucking ripped in that shit. He looks great.
That's the idea I want to touch on. It's like I like that Mike Zeck drew the Kraven pretending to be Spider-Man different than Peter Parker.
Oh yes, 100%. I noticed that too.
The fight scenes are very like much more brutal, much more violent than you see Peter Parker doing that. And like the way he's drawn,
right?
You know, it signals all the idea like Kraven doesn't just want to kill quote unquote Spider-Man physically. He wants to kill the idea of a Spider-Man until the last issue.
Yeah,
until the last issue, which is like, all right, the last issue kind of doesn't make sense to me, or the turn that Kraven takes was like, oh, my mom was insane and now I'm insane. I didn't quite understand that. Whereas like I cannot let. I'm giving up at this point. That did not make sense to me. It felt like maybe needed like one more issue to explain all that, or maybe I don't know enough about Kraven's background to have his mom being insane to like make sense. There was a moment where like, and again, trigger warning in spoiler alert, when Kraven like goes to like off himself, I'm like, that feels a little too convenient. You know what I mean? To me.
Interestingly, apparently they had to do sort of a follow-up book because the author had been receiving letters that felt that this book glorified suicide.
Self-harm.
Yeah.
Of being like, oh look, it's part of this like beautiful narrative arc. This is the only way that makes sense. This is how the closure happens. I could see that.
It's a little too sudden for me. Yeah. We can talk about something more lighthearted after that.
Yeah, Nick, do you want to go into the poetry research you did?
Oh God. I mean, like the poetry stuff, like far be it from me to be like, don't quote poetry at me, or like the idea that like
you an anti-intellectual, Nick.
Right. Yeah, like the idea that like the moment you enter poetry, it's like, okay, like you're posturing, right? Like, come on. But there are the buts again. I did research, and by research I mean I spent 20 seconds on Wikipedia.
Yep, as we all do. Go on.
Right. And where did I put this note? Oh, right. So this whole spider burning bright in the forests of the night, what a mortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry, which of course the original is tiger. So this is William Blake's poem, The Tiger, which apparently has to deal with, quote, discussing God's intention and motivation for creating both the lamb and the eponymous tiger. And then I read a little of the poem and then realized it went more than like 4 lines and was like, I'm good. And
you're like, Wikipedia was enough for me.
Yeah, but it's interesting because it does seem to also sort of discuss the idea of like creating, in some ways, you know, creating the hunter and creating the prey, and what does that mean to have that relationship, and to, you know, potentially in this work maybe invert that relationship. I mean, it's hard to ignore, and I'd have to sit and look at it again, but obviously there are so many parallels, there's so much symmetry in terms of some of the panel work, and I think you see some of that with the Kraven's death and Spider-Man's death, and, you know, the burying in the coffin, and the, you know, the throwing the dirt on the hole, And originally it has the spider you see, and then eventually towards the end it becomes the spider and the rat. I did really, really think that sequence of the dirt filling up the hole was like, that's like perfect sequential art for me, where you see the narrowing of the panel as it gets
Mhm.
smaller and smaller as the hole gets filled up. So it almost feels like the panel is being squished from the left and the right, and it's forcing the dirt to fill up to a point that, like, you see the chud word art as the shovel is throwing the dirt, and as the dirt fills it up, like, it literally covers the word art. Like, you can see the word art partially submerged, and then it just goes
Mm.
over it completely.
I
And
didn't notice that
like,
at all. That's really cool.
no, it's really cool. Like, I thought that was like, that's perfect comic book for me right there. Like, I get you've got Kraven smashing people's heads and shit, but I'm like, oh yeah, the way they filled the hole in the ground was real neat.
That's good though, because like that probably took what, like a whole day of work to ink that page or pencil that page.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like easily, and I'm sitting here going like, look what a fabulous
miss that.
drama king Kraven is. Like,
I mean, that's the one thing I do want to highlight. I mean, reading this book, Mike Zeck's artwork is so great, and there's so many moments where like there's parallel stories happening at the same time. He's able to draw that last issue where like you see Spider-Man like rediscovering himself, like when he forgives Vermin. At the same time, they're cross-paneling that with Craven's grave being dug by the gravedigger at the same time, or the moment where Spider-Man is in the sewer, is having flashbacks of being in the coffin.
Right.
Like, Mike Zeck is doing such amazing visual storytelling. Those are those moments where I'm just like, you don't need to have I wish DeMatteis is a great writer, but I wish he had been more silent in those moments. Like, you don't need the dialogue over those pages. I feel like Mike Zeck did such a great visual storytelling job.
Yeah.
At certain moments of the stories, like, you kind of don't. It feels like the dialogue is redundant at points in the story. It's like you don't need that,
Yeah, in the earlier part of the story, I definitely noticed the silent gravedigger panels that were sort of interspersed while the setup was happening.
Right. Right.
So I do agree with you that words wise, this comic could have breathed a little bit more and trusted the art a little bit more. But
100%. Yeah.
What can you do?
I mean,
let's like hop in our time machine.
But again, it's 1987. Like, they had to, like, comics were differently back then. Like, we all read the version of this which was on Hoopla, which is a collective version. I feel it might have been recolored by Mike Zeck and someone else.
It's funny you say that, because when I was reading the book, I was like, this feels like there might be a little of an early 2000s recolor job going on here. Yeah.
That's so specific.
It's so specific, but it's messed up that, like, once you've that sounds gatekeeping. Once you've read enough comics, which I think all of us have here, like, you can sort of see something like that. I mean, I see it a lot because I've read a lot of Dark Horse comics, which got this terrible idea around the early 2000s that they wanted to digitally recolor a lot of them. So I unfortunately have been exposed to a lot of bad digital recoloring, and that's not.
Unfortunately, Nick has suffered this, so you don't have to.
Yeah. And I don't know if this book runs like completely afoul of that, because I think a lot of it is just 80s colors being 80s colors, and I like
honestly.
it. Yeah. Like I said, I love the purple. The purple is great.
Nick, how does one spot an early 2000s color job? Like,
it's
like, are there markers?
It's so hard to explain, like, but when you've seen it, like, it's like they dial up the brightness, like the God.
You're like, I came here for some real moody, dark, grainy shit, and now you've given me something that's
like
been
weirdly
flatted,
brighter and blown out almost at points. Okay. I'll send you some of the early Aliens comics that that they got the wrong idea on. I think this also happened with the early Star Wars comics. Oh
Okay.
yes, this happened a ton when they digitally recolored. Sorry everyone, this is now turned into a coloring talk.
Go on.
When the original Star Wars comics came out versus when they got recolored, people got all pissy because originally when they colored Darth Vader, and this is true to what I was talking about with the Spider-Man comic, you know, you would see a lot of purple used in substitution for black. So Darth Vader looks pretty fucking purple in the original comics.
Hell yeah.
Dark purple. I fucking love it. But apparently a lot of other people threw a little shit fit and said, "Oh, what's going on here?" So they recolored that comic, and you know, now it looks like just, and it's not even like a, it doesn't look
like
good.
black
It's,
with blue highlights.
yeah, it's bad. It's bring back purple Darth Vader, okay? Like that's all I'm saying.
I'm just envisioning that Paul, that Batman cover with like the rainbow Batman suits.
Yes.
Like that, but for Darth Vader. Like
Rainbow Darth Vader.
He's got a suit for every color.
I mean, I do think that's weird. Like I feel like the version that we read that was on Hoopla, whatever reprint that was, the coloring looked authentic to the time. They didn't try to recolor it. But again, I couldn't imagine like reading that comic the way it was colored digitally on a printed page in 1987. It would have been washed out and kind of like, you know, would not have worked. So I feel like Mike Zeck might have gone back like
there was some touch-ups
for the reprint,
yeah.
recolored it. I think it looked really good, the version we read. Also want to highlight the version we read that was on Hoopla. The back matter was all like Mike Zeck's original pencils for the covers.
Oh, fuck,
which were
yeah.
fucking stunning. I mean, the covers for these 6 issues are iconic. This is the first time I've read the actual story. I've seen all of those covers, you know, throughout my life reading comics. Like they're all so iconic.
Do you have a favorite
as far as I can do my research on, which research means just looking on Google or Wikipedia. It's like Mike Zeck drew the covers first. Like, oh, here's the story. I'm going to draw the covers for the 6 issues first. So get a tone of it. And you can tell, like, those covers are so iconic. The one of Spider-Man busting out of the ground in front of his gravestone, I mean, magical. What an amazing image. So, yeah.
So do we think taking this back to the upcoming film, can there be a Kraven story without Spider-Man?
Well, didn't they already say that they did say Spider-Man will be in the movie? I think that's
Will he be in the movie?
I think that's been confirmed. I think that's been confirmed. Yeah.
I mean, that would I will flip my lid in that movie theater, let me tell you.
I don't think that's legally possible. So
well,
we'll find out.
It's legally possible if they keep him buried in the coffin and he never gets out, right?
Oh, that's true. They just show him so this is like Cure Lies Spider-Man.
All right. So we'll see.
Oh God, I would love that. Can you fucking imagine?
I mean, we did see. I saw a trailer for the film. I didn't realize that Russell Crowe is his dad. I don't know if it's like in flashbacks or
that
will
casting
be happening
seems
in the story.
Perfect,
right?
Yeah.
And you know what it honestly made me think of, because of like the caliber of film I expect this to be. It reminded me of wasn't Russell Crowe also cast in the Universal Monsters universe as like Dr. Jekyll, but since the Mummy tanked, that never went anywhere. So I was just thinking of those films.
Yeah.
Like, this is the level of quality I want / expect from this. I don't need it to be cinema. I need it to be entertaining me for 2 hours.
Well, yeah, I don't. Kraven is such a fascinating character because, like, I have no knowledge of him outside of this one story I read and knowing he's a Spider-Man villain. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of him being like part of like Russian like royalty lineage is like fascinating, but based on the trailers I've seen, that might not be the version of we're getting in the movies. Yeah.
Especially this book rolling out, as the USSR is dying and the Cold War is, starting to cool down. It's interesting to think about him in that lens, especially because clearly he has no love for any of that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, in this comic, he published in 87, and in the comic he says that he's been alive for 70 years.
Oh, right. Yeah, totally. Yep, that's 100%.
So in this comic in particular, timeline wise, that would put his family leaving as part of the whole
revolution,
Anastasia thing.
I mean, that's what I was thinking of it too. Yeah,
to use a pop culture marker.
He does mention that, like, oh, my parents had to flee because they were capitalists. So, like, I mean, I don't have much sympathy for him to begin with. But they're royals.
But to your point, it'll be interesting to see, like, are we just doing like he's a person with an average lifespan and we're seeing him come out of like communist era Russia versus you get halfway through the film and they drop like he's not a vampire, kids, but he's been around for a while and he's got some big feelings about some complex geopolitical items.
You can bet that they're gonna like want to do a couple flashbacks into a couple different eras, but you can also bet that they want to market this movie in every single country they can, and they'll do whatever they can to not ruffle any feathers with any sort of I think we all remember all of that Avengers kerfuffle with what was that, appeasing China and
makes you nostalgic for Cold War era Bond films, no? Tell me who the bad guy is.
Very clear. Very clear. Yeah.
Final thoughts on Kraven The Last Hunt, Paul?
So again, doing my research for this, which again just involves punching Kraven's Last Hunt into Wikipedia, I had no idea that James DeMatteis actually originally had this story for a Batman story. So his original idea was like, well, let me do a Batman story where Joker kills the Batman, and then after he does that, becomes sane because Batman's not around anymore. So I had no idea that was the original basis for this story, which makes sense. He could not do that because Alan Moore and Brian Bolland were doing the Joker...
Killing
Joke at the same time. In 1994, he actually got the chance to do his version of the Batman version of the story, which was published as the story Going Sane in The Legend of the Dark Knight, which I did read years and years ago. I have no memory of. It was very funny to know that was the impetus for that, was this Spider-Man story.
It feels like a time for you to revisit that Batman story now that you've read this and compare them.
Exactly, because I love Batman and also Spider-Man, and I thought this was a very good story. I did think that the overarching idea of like, I'm not just going to defeat a villain, defeat my enemy, but I'm going to become my enemy is a standard superhero trope, but it was handled really well in this story. I did think, the idea of Kraven not just defeating Spider-Man physically, but spiritually, mentally, that all made sense to me. And like I said, Mike Zeck's artwork is fantastic. This is a beautiful looking comic, top to bottom. So I'm glad I had a chance to read it.
No. Nick, final thoughts on Kraven?
Yeah, I think this manages to be a book that is, especially even at first blush, it's very much of its time, but I think it also manages to somewhat transcend that. And it's interesting to put it into the context of coexisting in the same era as like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, because it definitely has a little, like I said, it's got a little of that, like, we demand to be taken seriously, but I don't think it's as full of itself, getting high on its own supply in the way that I think some of those other works have, even over the years, maybe not been quite as kind to them. Although, Frank Miller has done his own legacy. He's done himself in some ways, but we don't. That's a whole nother story at this point. But
it's a whole different episode, Nick.
Yeah. The only thing I would say, like, this bugged me, and I couldn't, got kind of hung up on it, so just gonna put this out there for other people. Like, Spider-Man is clearly wearing like the black Spider-Man suit, but he's not Venom. But this is the point. I think, again, I don't know a lot of Spider-Man, but like there's a point where he has a black Spider-Man suit without being Venom, right? Because like that's what's happening here, right? Okay.
I just decided what that's one of those things where my brain just decided to gloss over it. I was like, sometimes superheroes have different costumes, and I'm not going to let it bother me that I don't understand the significance of this one.
Well, I'll tell you
he's
what
not a
helped me
symbiote.
is that there's a point where he comes back from being in the rain, and he goes back to his apartment, and he takes off the top of the suit and hangs it over the top of his door. And I went, okay, clearly we're not dealing with the symbiote. I was like, all right, I could just cast this aside now.
I don't know.
I feel like that's just like, go ahead, Paul.
I don't know when that happens because this is after Secret Wars. So Secret Wars is when he finds the black costume. I feel like Secret Wars is 86 or 87. But I don't know when Venom becomes a thing. I don't know when they decide he got the costume from an alien during Secret Wars. I don't know when that happens. Again, like,
this is going to show my ignorance, but doesn't Venom show up with, Todd McFarlane drawing that iconic?
It's Todd McFarlane.
And it's got to be close. It's got to be 88 or 89. Yeah, because I feel like, so these issues cover, I wrote them down in the notes here. These issues cover Amazing Spider-Man 293 to 294. Yeah. Within half a year, Todd McFarlane is drawing Spider-Man, and that's when the Venom, symbiote suit kind of happens. So we're right there. Yeah.
Wikipedia says the symbiote was originally introduced as a living alien costume in the Amazing Spider-Man number 252 in May 1984, with a first full appearance as Venom in the Amazing Spider-Man number 300 in May 1988.
That would be the Todd. Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
We love you, Todd.
We figured it out.
Keep collecting those baseballs.
Toddy Mac, my boy.
Well, this comic is a great example of understand that it is good, not necessarily for me. Like, I'm glad I read it for the show, so I have this frame of reference.
Yeah.
I can't think of anybody that I would recommend this to because this feels so specific to like, do you like really gnarly superhero comics? And
do you like
or
Cronenberg movies?
Do you like
I do.
Do you like Kraven the Hunter? Which, like, if there wasn't gonna be a feature film about him, who would know who Kraven the Hunter is?
I mean, you could just sell this book as like, do you like butts?
I mean, I know you're joking, but again, I do feel like Marvel and Spider-Man in general don't have many standalone, you can hand a trade to somebody like, here's a good like standalone Spider-Man story. This is that. I do feel you could hand this. Do you know who Spider-Man is? You know what I mean? Do you understand who Spider-Man is? You can read this independent of any other Spider-Man comic and enjoy it as one complete story.
I think it's also like, do you not know who Spider-Man is? That's okay. He's barely in this book.
Exactly.
Come watch this rat man eat a bunch of ladies.
Do you want to see some real weird, scary shit and some butts? Because I've got a book for you.
I mean,
well,
Nick, you're talking
note.
to me. Yeah.
Well, you already read it, Paul, so we already recommended it to you.
You'll have to wait 6 years, Paul. You can read it again.
Yeah, I'll go read your Batman story. Well, thanks so much, Nick and Paul, for joining me for this conversation about Kraven. Thanks, as always, to our listeners. Thanks to Zander for editing, Danny for coming to the rescue with a last-minute proof listen. And as always, comics are good, and so are you.